Let's move on to the second part of this, which surfaced yesterday, which is based on the first-degree murder conviction. Now we're going to move into the sentencing phase, and it is possible that she would get the death penalty, which is on the table in Arizona. She was interviewed after the verdict, and she said, "I don't want to live out my natural life. That would be far worse than the death penalty." Let's play that first, and then I want to discuss that because it gets into a lot of other interesting things too.
Are you focusing on the court, or are you focusing on what could be the worst outcome for you?
Well, the worst outcome for me would be natural life. I would much rather die sooner than later. Longevity runs in my family, and I don't want to spend the rest of my natural life in one place. You know, I'm pretty healthy. I don't smoke, and I would probably live a long time. So that's not something I'm looking forward to. I said years ago that I'd rather get death than life, and that still is true today.
Okay. First of all, even her still, even after the conviction, her demeanor and delivery is very disconnected from reality, isn't it?
Well, she could be in shock, but perhaps she's just come to terms with this over the duration of the trial.
Let's talk about this. What would you prefer in her case? Would you prefer the death penalty, or would you prefer life in prison, given that she's a pretty young woman?
I've said countless times that I think life in prison is a more cruel fate than the death penalty. Hard to say. I guess for me, it would depend on the prison I was going to, right?
I have to say, can't we look at this and say maybe this is some evidence that the death penalty isn't the right punishment, in the sense that it's a pretty miserable life in prison, particularly when you're this young. Isn't this even more evidence that not only has the death penalty not been, number one, executed fairly, in other words, mistakes are made, number two, it doesn't even really appear that it is the harshest sentence possible in many cases, Natan?
Well, that gets to a separate issue, which is whether the death penalty should exist, should be legal because it's a worse penalty, or because that's the equivalent of what the person did as a crime.
And that's not my argument either.
Right. So I don't know that this is necessarily the way to argue it. A lot of people who argue against the death penalty make, I think, a better argument, which is who's the state to kill people.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a better one than in each individual case, you might determine that death is a worse penalty or life, depending on what the person said and the specific circumstance.
That's never been my argument against the death penalty. But for people who are in favor of it, I have many other reasons, including the ones Natan said. For people who are in favor of it because they want the most severe punishment possible, we hear often that people would rather have the death penalty than life in prison. Therefore, is it even really the most severe punishment? However,
well, it depends on the person.
Depends on the person. But the other thing I want to say is belief in hell something that increases support of the death penalty? In other words, is there a group of people who say, because when they are killed by the death penalty, they will go to hell, we want the death penalty for that reason? In the same way that belief in the biblical end times stifles action on climate change, could belief in hell make people more in favor of the death penalty?
That, I think, is a completely different discussion. Hard to say, but I do think, well, I think we know that when you're dealing with crimes where the outcome could be the death penalty or life in prison, neither of those is ever a deterrent.
No, that we know for sure.